Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. This one's going to be a little bit lean because we are finishing up our initial uh, kind of what I think of as being the established readings for our course in terms of getting a little bit of history into what was happening around the before and just as European settlers began to populate the North American continent. And today, you are reading one of the more um, disparaging of chapters, which kind of goes fully into, well, I mean, it's called Bloody Footprints, right? Chapter 4 in Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Um, it's an information dump, which is the reason why it's the only chapter that we're reading for today. And at least when I read it, it kind of inspired a whole series of questions that I had, especially because I didn't know a lot of the material. I didn't know a lot of the things that had actually occurred. And so that's the reason why we have our reading response for today being so open ended. So after you read chapter 4, I'm asking you to highlight 3 points of information that resonated most with you. And please make sure you cite, right? It's always good to practice that. We're in college. You are now a collegiate scholar. And we should always be doing that because it's actually an ethical way of noting where you're getting information from, right? I mean, we know this from high school, I'm sure, but we definitely want to extend that particular kind of why can't I think of my words this morning? Maybe this beanie is too tight. But our discipline, there we go. We want to exercise the tenets of our discipline. So I'm asking you to highlight 3 points of information that resonated most with you. And the reason for that is because when we when we tend to identify those things and we reflect, which I'm also asking you to do, on the information, the most kind of intuitive questions emerge. And that is the last part of the reading response for the chapter. And that is, what questions emerge as a result? This is important to be doing in our class because so much of the first couple weeks, just gathering all this information, we are trying to posit questions as a group, as a class, as an individual. And those questions are going to fuel much of what we do for the remainder of the quarter because we're going to be doing investigatory research and expanding our knowledge as groups, as a class, but then also expanding our knowledge based on the curiosity of us as individuals. And you'll see the way that the assignments are designed, it, it's working to attenuate the kind of interest and focus that you want to pursue specifically because we're doing such a large survey class, right? I mean, it's covering 500 years of history, and then it's also covering indigenous culture, and we're also looking at post colonialism. It's a lot. And the goal here is that you're paying attention to the places where you're sticking most to the information because that individually might be activating you as a scholar. And we want to cultivate that curiosity that you're beginning to engender. So that's why we're doing these reading responses so that we can specify that interest, right? I mean, this chapter might be only 20 some pages, but there's so much info. And there might be a little kernel of information in the entire chapter that you are most curious about. And we want to be able to let you go down that rabbit hole. So write those questions, make those questions robust, make them authentic to your interest. That's going to be where you want to put most of your psychic energy for that reading response. The other great thing about the reading response is it might be fuel. It might actually generate questions that could potentially manifest themselves into the very first formal assignment that we're doing in the course, which is the group presentation. So if you notice in the announcements, I have assigned all of you to groups. And you can take a look at the announcement, but just very, very quickly, in week 5, we're going to be doing these group presentations. Group 1 is Theo, Asia, Karenza, John, and Vinesh. Group 2 is David, Lauren, Julia, Ride, and Walker. Group 3 is Isaiah, Elliot, Caroline, Kwaku, and Natalia. And you are all presenting February 1st. That's a Tuesday. Then on February 3rd, Group 4, which comprises Luca, Alexi, Eve, Alex, and Yash, and Group 5, Kaylee, Abe, Carson, Sarah, and Connor. We're going to be dedicating week 5 to these presentations. Hopefully we're back, cross fingers, and that we can do these live. That is the goal. And we're doing them as a way to begin this attenuation of interest that we might have. So I'll just briefly read the presentation prompt just to kind of give you an idea. It's under the week 5 module, End in Assignments, as Inquiry Group Presentation. So I'm just going to read this and contextualize it. Your group has been asked to identify, inspired by the readings, a question or inquiry of interest and give a presentation on your research of this inquiry. This presentation needs to be a dynamic exploration of the material that stimulates and informs the viewer, of course, namely your peers in the classroom. These presentations are roughly 15 minutes, and then they'll be followed by a Q&A by the rest of the class so that we can even dig deeper. We can ask even further questions. You see what we're doing here? We're perpetuating a cycle of questions as a way to kind of get closer and closer to what fascinates us most about this content, whether it be on a conceptual level or on a topical level, a historical level. That's up to us to determine. What these presentations are going to do is basically be some kind of amalgam of inquiry that the 5 students who are in the group kind of come to a consensus onto what they're interested in investigating beyond the texts that we're reading. Yeah. And we want these questions to have a depth and complexity to them. So not just something that we could easily, Google, but that we might need to kind of assemble some research in order to come up with an answer. So not so much the what and the what and the what kind of questions, but more the how and the why questions is what we're going for these investigations, right? Because this book and the other texts that you're reading, I mean, they're already telling you all the what and the what, right? We want to get into the hows and the whys. So the presentations are, and you can review this, a basic overview of the subject. So just kind of contextualizing what you all are investigating. Let's say you all are very interested in knowing more about Bacon's Rebellion, as we read about in chapter 4, but only for like 2 sentences. Maybe you want to investigate, the historiography around that. So you would kind of give us that general contextual coverage. And then, of course, you would be going deeper into what it is that you really want to discover, right? You also, in this presentation, you want to have a multimodal aspect to it. I mean, because it is a presentation and we don't want to just have our voices. And then lastly, and again, the most important part is posing more questions that arise as a result of investigating the question that you started with. And that hopefully will inspire any and all of us for the research-based papers that we're going to be doing that are inspired by this group presentation. So you see how everything is interrelated. Okay, so that is the presentation that you're being asked to do um, for week 5. So we have a minute. I'm going to also be make sure that you all have each other's emails, um, so that you can begin, an email thread or a Google Doc. You all know who each other is, who each other are. Uh-oh, grammar is losing me. I think this beanie's on too tight. Apologies. So the the presentations again aren't happening for another 3 weeks, but between now and then, maybe really think about how these reading responses that I'm asking you to do could be potentially inspiring, the kinds of questions that you might want to bring to your group, and for you all to come to a consensus about what it is that you want to explore. And having that in mind, it might give you a sense of even more finite purpose for fulfilling those reading questions. Yeah. And then, of course, just enjoy the readings. In addition to that, I also have, because I know that our book largely talks about the United States, but I think it's important for us to think about North America as a whole, because we saw settler colonialism affect, what is now Mexico and also Canada. And that is the reason why I'm kind of broadening us out a bit as well. If you notice in the week 2 module, I have in the supplemental materials, it's an animated documentary on the fall of Tenochtitlan, which is now currently modern day Mexico City. Um, and this is the story of the Spanish settler colonizing of Mexico, and in particular, the fall of the Aztec Empire and the Tlalocs. So I think it's a very compelling documentary, and it's done so in a decolonial style. It's short, and it also tells you much more about the figures of Montezuma and Hernando Cortez. We know them from our history books, perhaps, as footnotes, as anecdotes, but we get to know a little bit more about what occurred between these communities, that led to the particular demise of such a powerful and sophisticated empire like the Aztec Empire. So take a look at that as well, and enjoy and see how it even relates to the kind of settler colonialism that's happening primarily among the British Isles coming to what is now the United States, and then of course the Spanish going to what is now currently Mexico. Next week, just to give you a little bit of a preview, we are going to go more into concept. For these first 2 weeks, we've just been laying some groundwork about history and kind of providing a revisionist history as a way to complicate the ideas that maybe we already possessed, preconceived notions about what occurred during the European occupation of North America. But next week, we're going to start going into concepts. And the first one is historiography. The idea, who records history, who disseminates history, and how that has an effect on the legacy of historical accounts, even if we know that they could be false or possibly, well, human, right, and fallible. How history is perceived, however, and how there's a duplicity happening in the way that information is engendered in a culture. For example, we have a great example in here, Bacon's Rebellion, right? Chapter 4 mentions Bacon's Rebellion, and Bacon's Rebellion, if you remember from your 10th grade US history class, it's known as a proto-event towards the American Revolution, right? It happened 100 years prior, and it's usually revered as a moment where the lower classes and even the races, including enslaved and free black folks who were already in the colonies, European indentured servants, free blacks, and slaves, all alike, joined forces against the ruling class, right? In this case, Governor William Berkeley of Jamestown. Now, we know that story, and it kind of acts as the the United States. This is the fabric of the U.S. We eventually, revolt against, the upper class tyranny. This group of scraggle muffins, right, who all band together, no matter what their race or creed, etc. And then, of course, as the history goes, Berkeley was chased out of Jamestown, right? And indeed, there was a changing of suffrage laws, and this is when the colonies grant non-landowner freemen to also vote, right? So a lot of these things seem to be precursors for the American Revolution that happens 100 years later. And that's the way we typically are taught Bacon's Rebellion, how it's this kind of proto-event that paves the path for what eventually becomes, a representative democracy, right? However, what was the initial disagreement between Berkeley and Bacon over? It was how to handle the adjacent indigenous communities. Bacon wanted them all destroyed. Indeed, to quote him, our design is to ruin and extirpate all Indians in general. Berkeley wanted to negotiate more with the adjacent tribes and communities that were juxtaposed to Jamestown. Bacon wanted to destroy all of the indigenous. We tend not to discuss that aspect of the history, yes? And I think that is exactly why we're going to go into historiography as our first kind of conceptual exploration of this time period. So make sure that you read chapter 4. Make sure you do those reading responses. Take a look at the group presentation that you're going to be presenting week 5. Get to know the folks that are in your group. Maybe start that email thread of some kind. Maybe you all can begin chatting about things that you're most fascinated by already. And then let's get ready for some historiography. Have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Otherwise, take care, you all.